Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review. This show was recorded on July 17, 2023. I'm Asbed Bedrossian.
And this is Hovik Manucharyan.
And we have the following topics at hand. We'll start with the latest developments in the Armenian Azerbaijani negotiations, since there was a meeting just over this weekend in Brussels. Then we'll brush up on the state of the economy in Armenia and see if the rosy numbers are a true indication of how people are experiencing the growth. We'll talk about the elections that will lead to a new mayor in Yerevan that will be held in September. We'll see how this is shaping up. And we'll also talk about some of the new publications that we're seeing that are trying to estimate the number of the war dead in the 44-day war. Finally, a quick reminder that the Citizens Initiative Hayaqve is still going on and deserves your signature. To talk about these issues, we have with us Hrant Mikaelian, who is a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He is also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. Great to have you on the show, Hrant. Welcome.
Hello, Hrant.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Let's begin by covering the negotiations that are actively ongoing. Earlier this week, several days after Aliyev unexpectedly praised Pashinyan, saying that he's happy with everything that Pashinyan has said so far, and he just needs to put it all on paper. We got a surprise announcement that Aliyev and Pashinyan would meet in Brussels on July 15. That is almost a week earlier than had been previously planned. And this basically surprised all analysts. And the negotiation session did happen while obviously Artsakh was completely blockaded during that time. And after the meeting, Charles Michel, president of the European Council and the moderator of that negotiation session, made an announcement painting a rosy picture. He repeated some of the same things that he said in the past, but also some eyebrow-raising comments equating essentially Aghdam and Lachin as supply routes for Artsakh. And in the end, Michel invited Aliyev and Pashinyan to discuss again this issue at the end of the summer. And in the meantime, we know that there is a five-way meeting scheduled sometime in between that will also be joined by Germany's Olaf Scholz and France's Emmanuel Macron. The reaction also from Artsakh didn't take long. David Babayan, advisor to Arayik Harutyunyan, called the announcement from Michel as humiliating. Hrant, have you read the announcement? Have you analyzed the outcome of this meeting? What is your take on the latest round of negotiations and what caught your eye?
Generally, from the publications and the interviews and statements regarding this negotiation, I can say that this was completely diplomatic catastrophe for Armenia, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, we've seen that Armenia did not have any agenda on these negotiations. Armenia just came as a watcher, as a side participant, while Azerbaijan had its own agenda. That is why Charles Michel is quoting that there should be another road, another new trick by Azerbaijan, so equalizing Lachin Road and Aghdam-Barda Road, to say that it's not that there is a blockade, instead there are several roads. Another thing is that equalizing these two roads means that blockade of the Lachin corridor is more or less okay, because it is part of the process of the switching and so on. So Charles Michel switched to pro-Azerbaijani position, which is also very important to note, because he says the former Nagorno-Karabakh region, which means he supports destruction of Nagorno-Karabakh. And by the way, let's state that there is still existing Artsakh Republic, a state entity, though it's not recognized, but it is a state. It has all state functions and institutions, and it is being destructed right now by Azerbaijan by bringing Artsakhi people to hunger. And Charles Michel is a participant of this process. So I want to bolden this. It's another story. The third thing is that Charles Michel considers all of that as a progress and thinks that real progress might be achieved, although he puts the negotiations to December, which means that in reality, there is not much progress. And if we remember Pashinyan's statements from May, after the Washington discussion, he said at the time, if the distance between us was 1 kilometer, now we are just 10 meters closer, which means just 1%, according to Pashinyan, just 1% of disagreements have been resolved on the negotiations. Okay, we can imply that these negotiations were more successful, but to be frank, we have no grounds for that. We see, of course, that Pashinyan is agreeing more and more on Azerbaijani conditions, but we see he has a red line, which is so-called Zangezur corridor, which is, of course, completely off the table from the point of view of Armenian interests. But I'm afraid that for Pashinyan, it's not because of Armenian interests. He just does not want Russians to be there. And this means that he views this issue as a geopolitical issue. And why I'm saying that? Another reason is that, and this is fourth layer, is what was out of the table. And who was out of the table? It was Russia. We have heard the statement by Russian foreign ministry that if Pashinyan agrees on Azerbaijanization of Artsakh, then Russia has no place to go and will not impose any other policy. But still, Russia wants to stay there. Also, we have heard a couple of days before a statement by Erdogan, who said that after 2025, Russians should leave Artsakh. So what we see. And then we have Pashinyan, who, before this negotiation round at least, he was stating that in Artsakh, after the Azerbaijanization of Artsakh, there should be the protection of human rights and the international peacekeeping mission. So he brings a condition for Azerbaijanization. It is not unconditioned process, and the condition is foreign, probably Western military presence there, and Azerbaijan disagrees on that as well. And ultimately what we see is, on first glance, both sides, authorities of Armenia and Azerbaijan, are more likely to participate in negotiations under the Brussels-Washington framework. But under the surface, it's that Pashinyan wants the negotiated agreement, while Aliyev does not want. Because if he does not agree, if he pushes militarily, then he might gain even more, because he will not have to make even small concessions. So I think still the general scenario for Azerbaijan, the main direction is a military direction, because after everything which Pashinyan is offering Aliyev, I think for Aliyev it would be very wise to agree, but he did not do. So I think that at this time, this negotiation, though it was meant to resolve some issues, it was meant to bolden, let's say, geopolitical direction of Armenia, but in reality it did not bring anything positive, except only thing that Charles Michel proved that Brussels is not a good negotiating point.
Yeah, the most worrisome obviously was that he, to me at least, that caught my eye, was he made no mention of the ICC decisions about the blockade, not even the ECHR, of course, but the International Criminal Court decision about the blockade. And he basically put an equal sign between saying that Armenians should agree to accept supplies both from Aghdam and Lachin. And it seems like basically an extortion. For instance, I'm thinking, would the EU welcome such a situation if Moscow completely surrounded Ukraine and prevented the West from supplying Ukraine and said, here, we can supply Ukraine? It just seems very problematic to me that such a statement is coming from a European official.
Of course, it is realpolitik as it is. It's not about values. It's not about democracy. It's not about human rights at all. And human rights are on stake in Artsakh. And I think every country and every union in any way should take into account the realpolitik. But when it comes into such a bold contradiction with its values, sometimes you should make some concessions in favor of values, or at least somehow balance it. If you push it so rudely, I think ultimately it will not play out well for the Brussels. Not just think, I'm sure, because it not only affects attitudes of Armenians, many see that, at least in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey, in Russia, in many bordering countries, and so on. And this case will be cited, repeated, and it will affect the credibility of many mediators in the future. So I think it is really problematic. And also, which is very important, while negotiations are not over, they are over only according to Aliyev. Charles Michel says the former Nagorno-Karabakh, which means in his mind the negotiations are over. He already decided which belongs to whom. And while saying that something is a status quo, which is not true, because in reality there is no Azerbaijan. you cannot come to Artsakh from Azerbaijan. Yeah. So still, it is a different political entity. His words presented as a status quo statement, in reality, they imply a violent attack on status quo. So his words just imply destruction of Artsakh state, which is also very important to be cited. And I think this will not play out well. And then it's another issue here with Armenian side, because of course you can blame Brussels, many blame Moscow and other mediators, but we can also remember a statement by Macron, who said, I cannot always protect Artsakh more than Pashinyan does, because when he says something, it's not already my issue. I cannot say something which contradicts Armenian line in this way. So ultimately, the issue is in Yerevan, and Brussels. Yes, it plays out the realpolitik, but generally the issue is in Yerevan.
Okay, now let's go to Stepanakert, because last week there were some signs that Stepanakert is getting more active in fighting back and fighting for its rights, despite the brutal and complete blockade instituted by the Azerbaijani regime. A new national movement was announced by the leadership in Artsakh. It kicked off with a huge rally in Stepanakert as tens of thousands of people flooded the Renaissance Square in Stepanakert on Friday in response to the call from the authorities. And that's in the conditions of the essentially all stores being empty. There's not a single source of gasoline. So in those conditions, all those people showed up. Before going into more details, I'm going to ask for your general impression about this rally, this movement, what the Artsakh authorities call. What was the goal of this protest in your opinion? And do you think that this is one of the tools that can complement the policy of Stepanakert in its goal to gain independence?
No, of course, it's one of the tools the Stepanakert authorities are using to show primarily Yerevan their opinion, but not only Yerevan. This was done prior to the negotiations in Brussels. We can also remember the fact that Pashinyan has passed the letter written by Hrant Mikaelian to the European Union officials, to Charles Michel. By that, on one hand, he distanced himself from Artsakh, but on another, he still presented the opinion from Artsakh to the negotiating party. Now, regarding the rally itself, we can also remember two facts which took place around the rally. One was that Vitaly Balasanyan was caught, but the reason is yet unknown. And another is that Ruben Vardanyan was refused to participate in the rally. And most probably, these two politicians were targeted still by Yerevan. So current Artsakh authorities are still trying to keep up with Yerevan, although they understand that current Yerevan leadership is taking them to the destruction of Artsakh state, but they have no other choice, at least in their view. So the situation there is unclear. Regarding the rally itself, on one hand, Artsakhi people show their opinion and so on, although I think in 1988 it was still much more, let's say, powerful. But on another hand, I think the level of organization by the authorities, the way the rally was organized, they make this message a one-day message. They are not creating movement out of this. That's what I see. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my impression is that Artsakhi authorities are trying to very strictly govern or affect how people will show their will. Instead of enabling people to show their will, they are trying to contain that. So to be frank, I don't have very good impression of that rally.
Yeah, in fact, basically the messages were they visited the Red Cross office and the Russian peacekeepers, basically the only two international representations in Artsakh. But many in the Artsakh opposition were cautious because essentially it could be perceived as a attack against the Russian peacekeepers, even though Hrant Mikaelian and well, not Hrant Mikaelian, the front face of this protest was Gurgen Nersesyan, the state minister. He essentially blamed Pashinyan equally. He blamed world governments, but in reality, when you look at what the protesters did, they visited the Red Cross office and the Russian peacekeepers. You mentioned the arrest of Vitaly Balasanyan. I have a little bit more detail on that. Basically, I think they wanted to arrest his son, and he was there. Now, when you talk to the opposition, some opposition alleged that it was a provocation, basically in order to target Balasanyan himself. So it's very interesting. It may lead to some clues about the real intentions of the authorities in Stepanakert. And the issue with Ruben Vardanyan, I was surprised because I didn't catch that nuance that basically he was prevented from attending the rally. I know that he issued a statement welcoming the rally. And during that statement, he directly blamed the government in Armenia for the current situation that Artsakh is in. But I didn't realize that he was actually prevented from attending. Is there anything more you can say about
Hovik, can I add one more thing? When Gurgen Nersisyan initially called for the rally and said that together we will decide the next steps that we will take, I was quite concerned that this could be the start of the Artsakhi government beginning to socialize the idea of a surrender to Azerbaijan, a planned and step-by-step surrender. But so far, I haven't gotten that impression from them. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I hope that is not the case, because I think the entire hope of the Armenian nation is on Artsakh to struggle. And obviously that's wrong, because we all must struggle. But the fact that they arrest a general, a hero of Artsakh, and not for a criminal case that's directly targeted at him. He's not an accused in that criminal case, but he was apparently, his lawyer said that he asked to see the warrant, and they wouldn't show any warrant. So he did not give him permission to do a search in his house for a criminal case that was targeting his son.
And so then they produced the warrant, I think, afterwards.
Well, I don't know if they produced the warrant, but at the time that they arrested him, they did not produce that warrant, according to his lawyer. Right. And this is just like, they in Armenia, they call this Operation Tushonka number 2. If you remember, early in 2019, they staged this operation against General Armen Grigoryan. They used this imagery of apparently supplies for like food and everything that was meant for the army that was apparently in his basement or whatever. But that turned out to be entirely completely false. Yet the end result was the humiliation of the Institute of Military Leaders. And Balasanyan has a lot of respect in Artsakh, and I don't know. I mean, many people see him as one of the people who could lead Artsakh out of the situation. In any case, I don't know, Hrant, we're talking, instead of asking you, what's your thought about Balasanyan more specifically, and the case about Ruben Vardanyan? I didn't realize that he was prevented from attending.
Ruben Vardanyan was prevented from having a speech. Maybe he attended, most probably, but he could not have a speech. Now, regarding Balasanyan, of course, he is respected, and he was a second candidate on the elections in, if I'm not mistaken, 2012 or 2017. And also he got 15% support in 2020. So he still is very influential politician. But to be frank, I don't know exact details, so I don't want to speculate. Obviously, it is connected to political struggle in Artsakh. And regarding the, the soft line of Artsakhi authorities, as far as I can understand, as of now, Artsakhi authorities are not going into direction of Azerbaijanization, so they are not that hardliners, but still they don't want to be integrated into Azerbaijan. And the way, for example, Charles Michel understands the Baku-Stepanakert dialogue is one thing, the way Aliyev understand that is second thing, and the way the authorities in Stepanakert understand that it's completely different thing. So I don't think they want to be Azerbaijanized. But another thing is that since there is a direct and long way connection between current Yerevan and Stepanakert government, they are not, and they cannot be completely independent. That's one issue. And the bigger issue is that they don't have grand plan. So I think in reality, they don't have good idea how to act in this situation. It's hard to blame that, because in this situation, it's really hard to find something. But anyway, they play only reactive role. So they don't plan, they just react. And this is problematic because all the time they have to respond to something happens outside. They are not trying to master the situation somehow. That's the reality. And as of now, of course, they are completely dependent on the foreign players, but still you can struggle to gain some indirect ways of affecting the policy of different players. And I think Artsakh government could do much more. And now coming to Gugen Nersisyan, I'm not sure he has much to say, to be frank, because he replaced Ruben Vardanyan. Many thought it's being done in order to open the blockade, but still Artsakh is under blockade and even under strict blockade, even worse than it was before, which means that it was just internal political struggle. And I think
Well, Hrant,
Nersisyan.
I think that Aliyev had demanded that Vardanyan must go, and I think it was basically to appease him that they got rid of Vardanyan as state minister. But then, of course, none of the promises on the other side, like Aliyev, didn't come through with any of the promises he made to continue negotiations.
Yeah,
Of course, but still at the time, many would say that it's to open the road, but it also did not happen. So maybe
Right.
it was a demand from Aliyev's side, but another thing is that the more you hear Aliyev and the more you follow his line, the worse off you are. So I think it was also a mistake, but also I think it had an internal political meaning.
Yeah.
This move. So generally, I think at least if this move did not have internal political meaning, Artsakh government could integrate Ruben Vardanyan in this rally and in such activities, because at least Ruben Vardanyan has some other ways to affect the situation outside of Artsakh.
Yeah, what's disconcerting for me is that even though the Pashinyan government keeps saying that they are bringing Artsakh back around the table to negotiate for itself, certainly we are not seeing Artsakh on any table anywhere. And in fact, it has been 10 days since Armen Grigoryan, the national security chair in Armenia, has been in Washington, D.C. for so-called intense negotiations. This is a week after Ararat Mirzoyan himself was there and met with the same officials. Grigoryan's formal statements about the meeting say challenges in the region and the wider region, and also closer US-Armenian cooperation on energy, economy, and democracy were discussed. Jake Sullivan's office has not commented on the meetings. Meanwhile, we are reading unconfirmed Russian telegram channels reporting that Washington and Baku have a whole bunch of demands. Now, we're going to put these things in our show notes, so please visit our show notes and check them out. But the gist of it, on top of all the things that we've already discussed, is that they want to bring 65,000 Azeri refugees into Syunik province, and then they want to allow Baku to create so-called quote-unquote some departments in Syunik to solve security problems for these Azerbaijanis who are going to move to Syunik. And then they want Armenia to get rid of the Gyumri base by 2026 and replace it with NATO training under partnership programs. Stuff like this that we have also read, like the Zangezur corridor, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what to make of all these things. There's not enough information. Do you know anything about why Armen Grigoryan is in Washington, D.C. for almost 2 weeks?
I don't know exact reasons. If we look at the intensity of these negotiations, intensity of the visits, and if we remember when he has been to Russia, it's obvious that it's about the foreign political orientation of Armenia, and the whole Artsakh track is mostly about that, because still, until Russian base is in Gyumri, until Russian peacekeepers are in Artsakh, Russia is present in the South Caucasus region. If Russians exit, they don't have a foothold in the South Caucasus anymore and don't have a way to come back. So I think this is the main agenda of these negotiations, although there might be many other details also imposed by Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan is trying to play out this situation as much as possible. But generally, I think, and remembering the Armen Grigoryan's past, I think it's more or less about foreign political orientation of Armenia.
Meanwhile, let's also take a look at statements issued from Moscow. One noteworthy statement was issued by Maria Zakharova, spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry. Some important points I would bring up about Armenia's recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan. She said, "We respect the sovereign decision of the leadership of Armenia, but it has radically altered the fundamental conditions under which the leaders of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia signed the November 9, 2020 statement. It has also changed the situation for the Russian peacekeeping troops stationed in the region." So that's a big issue that I want to come back to. But she also mentioned that we believe that under these conditions, the responsibility for the fate of the Armenian population in Karabakh should not be placed on third countries. The preparation of a peace treaty between Baku and Yerevan should begin immediately based on the agreements reached earlier. And she proposed to organize such a meeting for signing of a treaty in Moscow. So despite everything said, Russia seems also eager to be the place where the treaty of capitulation of Armenia is signed. But going back to the first statement that I mentioned about basically the recognition of Armenia about the status of Artsakh radically changing the situation on the ground, is Russia, how do we interpret that? How would you interpret that? Is Russia basically saying that it can't guarantee the security of Artsakh because Armenia has recognized it as part of Azerbaijan? Or is there some other way to interpret that statement?
Let me add one more question to this. Does this mean that that recognition completely invalidates what was signed on November 9? I mean, what part of that agreement at this point can be valid since the landscape has changed so radically?
Well, let's start with Russia. I think we should take into consideration the strategic and political culture of Russians, and especially of the current government, which is there already for 20 years, if not more. And what we see there is that Russian government is also very reactive in foreign policy. They don't care very much about the human rights and about those who should have been protected. Not saying about Artsakh, but we can also see how they are behaving towards those who support them in Ukraine. So it's not only about Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and so on, but it's generally about Russian foreign policy. So that's one issue. Second issue is that, no, that's already second, because first is that Russia is reactive. In reality, I think Russia would like to have more pronounced Artsakh status, but since Yerevan is rejecting that, they are not going to push for Artsakh status. They are just going to push for their own presence in Artsakh, which is not going to play out. We have heard Erdogan's statements, who has said that Russians should leave after 2025, and he cited the November 9 agreement in this way, that if one side rejects, implying that Azerbaijan will reject, it means that Russians will leave the Artsakh area where they are deployed. Now, regarding another capitulation or so-called peace treaty, I think the issue is that Russians see that Yerevan wants to sign a treaty, and they are saying that if it is anyway going to be signed, let us be the mediator. But anyway, it will not play out, because Yerevan's tie to Russia was mainly based on the security cooperation, while if Armenia loses territories, if Artsakh loses territories, then there is no more security cooperation between Russia, because Russia does not support Armenia. But of course, we should take into consideration the Ukrainian context as well, where Russia still struggles, despite some improvements, but still struggles and does not show high level of efficiency, and thus does not have lots of resources to allocate on Artsakh front as well. And it's already becoming a front, because we see Azerbaijan is gathering new forces around Artsakh. So it's another issue. So generally, I think Russia is either politically and militarily weak, and at least incapable of pushing own agenda. At the same time, they are citing Yerevan, and this is a valid point, because at least we have heard more or less the same from Macron's side. They're saying, if Yerevan approves Azerbaijanization of Artsakh, what should we do? So what we see is that this agreement works only partially, and only in the side where Azerbaijan can use it. Because, for example, we see that the issue of Armenian prisoners of war is already closed. So neither Armenia nor, for example, Charles Michel cited this point. Another issue is that Artsakh status should be resolved in the future. No, they want to do it as soon as possible. Another issue is that there are some other guarantees and mechanisms which are generally removed, and only The only point which is cited by Azerbaijan and Turkey is that they can decide the fate of the peacekeeper contingent and remove it after 2025. So generally, I think it is invalid, although it still exists on the paper. But we can remember the Madrid principles, for example, which are also generally invalid, and the Minsk group, OSCE, which has not been completely resolved. And the ambassador of the United States said a couple of weeks ago that Minsk group still exists, but at the same time, no one is holding negotiation in that format. So I think at least we have ambiguity in this issue, but generally there is no negotiation process. Rather, it's the power diplomacy and military diplomacy, which is being held by Azerbaijan, and Pashinyan is also involved in this game because he does not do anything to counter this pressure, and he just accepts Azerbaijani points gradually. We know that there are in reality points of recreating or creating of Azerbaijani and Turkish communities in Armenia, and in reality there is already ongoing propaganda in Armenia approving that step. So I think more or less there is an agreement on that as well. So we should see where it goes because the negotiation process is not transparent.
Okay, I'm going to turn our attention to the state of the economy in Armenia, Hrant. On July 5th, Pashinyan gave a Constitution Day address. In it, he mentions the health system, pensions, jobs, things like that. Again, check our show notes a little bit later for the exact quote and what he said about these various sectors. But basically, he said that Armenia is a social state and health services provided to citizens by state order has doubled. Yet recent reports that we've read say that the government is not adequately funding these social services. So what is your experience with the system, and is there a systemic underfunding of the health services to citizens?
Well, I know that there have been some health services added to the basic package. Also, the services for the children have been extended from age of 5 to 7 to 18. But at the same time, if you ask my personal experience, the quality of these services is too low. It's so low that you cannot use them at all. They misdiagnose, make false diagnosis. They cannot improve anything. I mean, it's getting worse and worse. So you can add some services. If you don't get the results, if you don't get proper diagnosis, you have to go to paid clinic, and that's what you have to do usually. And if you don't do, you just waste your time. That's my experience. And if we go beyond that, for example, regarding the pensions, Pashinyan announced that he's increasing the pensions.
Well, let me interject for a second, Hrant, because that was exactly what I was going to ask you about right after this. The average pension, he said, has increased by 22%, and basic pension has increased 50%. Of course, he measures also everything against 2018.
If we are talking about the average pension, then we should also remember the average inflation rate, which has been more than increase of pensions, because first of all, we don't measure the change in pensions just the day of increasing the pensions compared to the some other periods, because we need to take the year as a whole, 2023, 2024, and so on, which shows that in reality, both in 2023 and in 2024, we will have lower pensions than in 2017, in 2016, and in 2015 in comparable prices. So the inflation rate was higher than increase of pensions. Even at this moment, he increased the pensions since July 1.
That's correct.
Let's remember one thing. He increases the pensions right now, and then the pensions stay like this for 2 more years. So we should take it into the average, and not just at the moment of increasing, because it also includes future premises. Anyway, during Pashinyan, and only during Pashinyan, because during previous governments, the growth of pension surpassed the inflation rate. But during Pashinyan, the growth of pensions have been lower than inflation rate. So
did you mean to say that actually inflation rate is higher than the growth of pension rate? Is that correct?
Yeah. And purchasing power of the pensions have been consistently decreasing, and the purchasing power of the pension, which we will have average pension in 2024, so current pension generally, and taking just 1% of inflation rate, which I imply for the next year, which is very conservative approach, but still let's assume it will be like that, will be 4% lower than in 2015. And what I mean in comparable prices. What this shows us that all the speculation on increase of pension are false. Also, compared to the average salary, we see that the size of pension is decreasing, the relative size of pension. Usually, we had it like 30% average pension to average salary. Now we have it already 25, which is going to turn 22 to 23 in the next year. So
Right.
generally, Armenia is not a social state. Armenia is a state where some people get much more support, some people get much less support, but instead they can consume news about their future prosperity.
So for reference, I put it in our show notes that as of July 1, I believe, the average pension is now 50,000 drams per month. The average salary is 256,000. I read someplace 261,000, but anyway, you get the idea. And the so-called consumer basket is 80,000 drams. So I'm almost concerned at that level. Are pensioners living below subsistence levels? Is there undernutrition, poverty levels increasing in the country, Hrant?
Right. And there is another layer. The average size of Armenian family is decreasing. Usually it was around 5 members. Let's say in pre-industrial era, it was between 5 and 6 members. In Soviet times, it was around 5 to 5.5. And in the first, let's say, 10 to 15 years of Armenian independence, it was around 5. Since then, it is decreasing. And now it is most probably around 3.2 or maybe even less, maybe 3.1 member of average household in Armenia, which means that in many cases, many pensioners already live alone. Also given the trend of emigration from Armenia, which is also very long-standing. So pensioners have now, first of all, much less social connections than they had used to have previously, and they are much more dependent on the state. Also, informationally, they are also dependent on the state because they are primary consumers of the state propaganda. That's why we see that in February, the only social group which was net supporter of the current government course was pensioners. Why so? First of all, they don't have enough knowledge on economy and so on, because in Soviet Union they did not teach you economy. Maybe they taught you the historical materialism, Marxist economy, but this does not have any connection to the market economy. So they don't understand what's going on with their own incomes, unfortunately. Another thing is that they are socially isolated in many cases. As I said, the number of members in the households has been decreasing during last decade and even more. And so they are isolated and they are dependent on the state. So very easy to manipulate, unfortunately, and be fooled on what's going on with their own pensions as well.
Hrant, is there a disparity between Yerevan residents and the regions?
No, there are no coefficients regarding the regions, of course, although in Yerevan the average prices are higher, but at the same time it also depends on how long did you work before going to pension. But we see that Pashinyan has increased to a bigger rate the size of minimal salary, which implies that disparities, I think, now are even lower, which also means that the more you worked, the less you gain. But anyway, the average salary is going to be 49.7 thousand dram, which is by current currency rate about 125 bucks. But still, it's very low income, not sufficient, not only for usual life, including medicine, which is very important for pensioners, but even food.
Didn't I read someplace that the minimum wage was 75,000, or am I wrong?
Yeah, and you could remember how a couple of years ago Pashinyan has increased the minimum wage from 68 to 75,000. But you can also remember that we had around 10% inflation rate 2 years consequently. So in reality, this also does not keep up. The minimum wage does not keep up.
Well, it's interestingly, the minimum wage is also below the consumer basket. So that's why I was considering this. There was something you said, Hrant, a little bit earlier that has also caught my attention, that Armenia may be doing good in the sense that some people in Armenia may be doing good. The Pashinyan government has consistently favored the IT sector and disregarded the agricultural sector, which is very important. This year, the IT sector was the beneficiary of extensive tax credits, while Armenian farms have been basically hung out to dry. Can you explain what the government rationale is with this strategy? I'm sorry to be a little facetious, but is the vision that Armenian society will work as technologists in Yerevan high-rises and then eat cheap food imported from Turkey, or what's the thought?
Let's take a brief look at what Armenian IT sector is. In most cases, and I mean vast majority, it is the continuation, a small portion of Californian IT sector. So basically, it's not something independent of Californian IT sector. It is a provider of some intermediate of IT products for the Californian IT sector. Now, if so, this means that supporting IT sector in Armenia means supporting Californian economy. And when they declared that they are going to cut the income taxes for the IT sector's employees that are exporting or working on exports, I understood that they are cutting taxes just for everyone to 5%. Yet this law has not been approved, but still the average tax rate for IT sector is significantly lower than for any other sector. Now, supporting Californian economy from Armenia is not very wise. First of all, it's small. It's Armenian economy, and Californian economy is big, but also it creates a mixture of globalized Armenian economy, which is very small portion of Armenian economy, especially when we look at number of people involved, but at the same time, it's very influential. And we see rise of new social class being created just before our eyes, new residential areas created where most of the residents will be the IT sector representatives. So it's just a matter of globalization. In reality, I would rather favor the IT sector representatives and companies which are creating the solutions for Armenian market, which also needs in reality IT solutions, much more needs than the foreign economies, because foreign economies have a place to choose. They can choose, but Armenian IT sector needs to provide technical solutions for other branches of economy, which does not take place in most cases. So this is another problem. So in reality, IT sector in Armenia right now is something which does not have any border. It's not even physically present in Armenia. Only its employees are physically present in Armenia.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you rightfully pointed out on Turkey. It's not just Turkey. They just buy anything imported. So their even physical connection to Armenia and to Armenian economy is very poor. So I think it is really problematic. So we need somehow to make IT sector in Armenia more Armenian, because now it is turning out to be something like a Soviet tech in Armenia, which was part of a Soviet military industrial complex. And the day Soviet Union collapsed, there were many, many engineers which were no more needed because they were connected to the Moscow, to the Soviet economy. And the same happens here. These IT sector representatives, they are connected to the Los Angeles. They are not connected to Yerevan, to Gyumri, to anything. And this is, I think, the major issue which future Armenian governments will have to handle. This is really becoming an issue that we have non-Armenian economy sector right now being created before our eyes.
We'll continue with this section because I think this is a very interesting topic, and a more holistic vision of an overall economy is needed, I'd say. Okay, let me turn our attention to the mayoral elections that are due in Yerevan in September. In 2 months' time, Yerevan will be voting to elect a new mayor. These are indirect elections. People vote for political parties. The parties nominate to form the new city council, and then the city council appoints a new mayor. If you ask me, it's a travesty that people don't get to vote and elect who they want for president, prime minister, mayor, but this is what it is. Anyway, last week we discussed where the parties and their candidates stand according to the latest MPG poll results. We'll put the slides in the show notes. But to summarize the poll, Hrant, civil contract candidate Dikran Avinyan is leading the field with 10.1%. A former civil contract member and maybe currently civil contract adjacent, as I call it, Hovik Manucharyan, has 8.2%. Hayastan Dashing's Levon Kocharyan is the only person who has cleared 5%. He's got 5.3%. Everybody else is under 5%. But this is interesting. Nearly 60% are undecided or uninvolved. So the question I have is, does this 60% represent apathy among the people, or is it an opportunity for some candidate or another to strike the right chord with the voters and run with it?
I would rather agree with your first option, because we have seen the rise of such people who are undecided or unwilling to participate since 2018, because the last years of Serge Sargsyan, we had more or less similar picture to what we have right now. The majority was undecided and minority was decided and split among the major political parties. So in most cases, these people are not willing to participate in elections because they think they don't have any better option than the government and they don't support this government. Why they think they don't have better option? I think it's also the opposition to blame because, okay, they don't support government, but they don't support opposition either. This means that there is miscommunication between different parts of society. Now, going back to the approval rates, we can have two approaches towards these approval rates. On one hand, we have just 10% support for Avignon and for civil contract for mayoral elections. And of course, we know that there will be some administrative resource utilized, and we already see that the government officials are pushing those involved in state apparatus in different ways. So this means they will gain some handicap, but it's not everything. Another part of the story is how those 60% will behave. One hypothesis is that they will not participate or they will split the very same way the existing figures are. This means that the civil contract will gain some 34% of vote, which is not enough to gain a mayoral position automatically, but also they can gain, out of 10, they will get, let's say, 30, and every party's approval rate, we should also multiply by the same amount, which means that not only these first three factions, but also maybe some other parties will overpass the threshold. Maybe Republicans, maybe the Aprelu Yerkir party, maybe some other parties like Aram Sargsyan Republic Party or some other parties. But anyway, the most important issue is, will Pashinyan be able to gain a coalition in the town hall? And if so, then he will approve his mayor based on that coalition. And also maybe small parties will not be included will not overpass the threshold, which will also mean that ultimately the civil contract will gain more than they collected on them during the election day. So I think generally, despite the very low approval rate of the current government, especially in Yerevan, they still might gain the mayoral position, and most probably this will take place because, unfortunately, in Armenia the election process is not. There is no good competition, and it's not in reality democratic. So generally, we have seen that authorities win all the elections, despite which authorities are, how big popular support do they have. And even if they lose the election, we have seen some such cases in Armenia during the last several years, they might arrest the elected mayor and then put someone else instead of him. And we have seen quite a few cases like that during the last 2 years as well.
They'll start corruption cases against the winners.
I think that's, definitely. I'm very much interested in some of the dark horse candidates like who Hovik Manucharyan may be partnering with. There's some rumors in press that he may be partnering with David Sanasaryan's Sovereign Armenia Party, in which case that would probably be automatically pro-Nikol. There's also, of course, as you said, Aprelu Yerkir, Manet Handilyan is unknown on who they. I think they may have excluded cooperation with civil contract, but I'm not sure. So I think there's still time. We can still come back to this topic. But in the interest of our time, I would like to cover one more topic today, which is a recent study that was released estimating the number of the number of dead in the 2020 44-day war. It has been nearly 3 years since the signing of the November 9, 2020 statement. And so far, the Armenian government has not released detailed information about the casualties. Sure, we have some information from the 1000 Plus Foundation. We have some names announced, during the war as the casualties occurred, but we don't have, for instance, date of birth, the place of birth, whether they're part of the Artsakh Defense Forces or the Armenian Defense Forces. I'm just wondering, why is it so difficult to come up with these numbers? And on top of all this, people are resorting to additional ingenious ways to conduct studies. For instance, this recent study published this week by Ariel Karlinsky from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in partnership with Orsola Torisi from the New York University in Abu Dhabi and the London School of Economics and Political Science. They use an interesting methodology which is focused on the excess deaths reported by Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Artsakh. According to the results of this study, which is linked in the show notes, the number of excess deaths of 18 to 49-year-olds and males is approximately as follows. For Armenia, it is 2,800. For Azerbaijan, it is 3,400 excess deaths. And for Artsakh, it is 310. What are your thoughts about, just in terms of a basic smell test for these numbers, what else can you tell us about the problems and issues associated with estimating the dead from the 44-day war? And again, why don't we have an exact count, which the government obviously has?
Well, this study is incorrect. First of all, at least we have the statement made by Pashinyan, who said at some point that we have 4,000 plus minus 50 dead during this war, which means that it is significantly higher than what the researcher has counted as 2,800.
Just one clarification. This is for 18 to 49-year-olds, but I assume that those are most of the people who fought in the war. I can't imagine a 50-year-old fighting. So I don't know how you would estimate or how would you extrapolate the numbers to the entire population, but this is only 18 to 49-year-old males.
Another issue is that in 2020, it is, of course, a bit difficult to count because at the same time, the coronavirus epidemic occurred and Armenia faced mass casualties of that epidemic as well. And for that epidemic, the excess deaths method was used in many countries and in Armenia as well. But there is a difference between the war casualties and the casualties from epidemic. Because if with epidemic, the issue is not the fact that the casualties, not the very fact of registration of casualties, but the way how they are registered. So for example, if someone died of coronavirus, he or she could be registered as being dead from heart disease or something else, which could be associated to that. We understand that. So that's why demographers would count the excess deaths, because how many deaths would happen in this country in this period of time, and the excessive number should have been associated with coronavirus. War casualties is something different, because in many cases, people who died in war were not found, and or at least they were not found at the period of time. So we have had the process of returning bodies or even parts of the bodies from the occupied part, Azerbaijani occupied part of Artsakh during 12 months or so after the war occurred. So this means that in reality, we could not have registered all the casualties during the period of war. Another issue is that so many people were counted during the war as just lost. So the number of casualties will not indicate everyone who died at that period. We should recalculate it, and there are some methods for that. Another issue is that we don't just have excess casualties in some periods of time. For example, during coronavirus, we had much less number of people moving because of the lockdowns. So number of people died in car accidents, for example, has significantly decreased across the globe, for example. So if you count only, and there is a group of reasons, which is external reasons of death, you will undercount it. But our statistics, both in Armenia and Artsakh, has indicated number of people who died from the war. Both these numbers were stretched during longer period because they have been registering people when their bodies were found. So it was stretched during longer period of time and then somehow recalculated. But even there, you can find figures which are bigger than 2,800 for Republic of Armenia. Artsakhi statistics shows between 600 and 700 people died during this war. So at least we can say that 4,000 is a lower bound of this number, which is significantly higher than what the researcher says. Because, as I said, this method is inaccurate. For example, if you try to count with the same method the number of people who died in the war in Ukraine, you will face the same issue. Many people are still counted as lost. They have not been found, their bodies have not been found or something. And why the government does not recognize all these casualties? It is because initially they did not want to show all figures because people would be shocked and it would increase the probability of them being overthrown. We remember the end of 2020, which was very turbulent. So government did many things to prevent that happening. And one of that policies was faking number of deaths in the war, which was at the end of the war, they declared that only 1,200 people were dead in the war. So this is another layer. Now regarding Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani statistics is also incorrect in that way for the same reason, because they understand that very easily, that you could check through the demographic statistics the number of excess deaths. That is very obvious. So if they want to disclosure some amount of deaths, you will find that in their demographic reports. The rest will be omitted from there. We know Azerbaijan has long history of demographic manipulations, but anyway, Azerbaijani official figure is, if I'm not mistaken, 3,100, and it should not be very unexpected thing that the number almost matches the number the researcher found there, because in demographic report of Azerbaijan, it's more or less the same figures that they have disclosed officially. I don't know, maybe it is the exact or rightful number, but I cannot be sure. And given that Azerbaijan has long story of demographic manipulations, I would mostly bone to that position. So I think all of these three figures are understatements, but unfortunately we don't know exact figures. We just can say that the methodology of excess deaths is correct only if we know that all the deaths were counted correctly at the time, and this is not the case with this war.
And when comparing deaths, I think it's also important to note that Azerbaijan basically had the help of thousands of Syrian mercenaries, and many are reported to also have died in the war, but they are not probably included in the official Azerbaijani statistics anyway.
Some 2,500 were reported to participate, but some 300 to 500 have been reported to have died in the war. So number of dead Syrian mercenaries probably is up to 500, not more, but still significant if we consider Azerbaijani casualties between 3,000 and 7,000. We can remember that according to Armenian Defense Ministry, and the numbers they have been publishing daily, on the daily basis, they stopped at around some 76 or 7,800 of Azerbaijani casualties. It could be overstatement, but we don't know, of course, to which rate it was an overstatement. But anyway, at least there is a number, and it was reported daily. And by the way, once I have compared all these figures and counted the expected intensity of war based on the daily basis. But anyway, I think that this figure is could be even closer to reality than the official figure of Azerbaijan, which is around 3,000 people. So generally, we have this number of Syrian mercenaries for Azerbaijan, which is not included in official reports of Azerbaijan. Then we have this calculation, and then we have reports by Armenian Defense Ministry during the war. So at least we can say that the number of Azerbaijani casualties should be between 3 and 8,000 people, but not necessarily close to 3 or 8,000.
Okay, as we wrap up our topics here, I want to remind everyone that if you're a citizen of Armenia and eligible to vote, that there is a citizens' initiative that is worth your attention and signature. It's called Hayaqve. And according to organizers, in the past 2 weeks, the movement has been able to get over 25,000 signatures. So find out more at hayaqve.am. That's HAYAQVE.am. They also have a Facebook page, facebook.com/hayaqve. So, all right. It's time for me to ask each of you if there's something on your mind this past week that you would like to share with us. Hrant, what's on your mind?
Asbed, by the way, before passing to my topic, maybe you will quote your relatives or just say it on behalf of yourself regarding the Vardavar, because I think it's also worth mentioning.
I will mention that as my own personal statement, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not just kids, because we have seen very different attention from government to that and very different activities of kids, because I've attended every Vardavar in Armenia since 2007, and it has all the time it has been different, never as active as today. So I think it's also worth mentioning. And now I will pass to my statement.
Okay.
This week I went to ancient Armavir, to the place of ancient Armavir, which is located on the tops of two hills in Armavir province. And by the way, both have strategic importance in terms of at least one of those hills is located right in the center of Arat Valley, and you can observe very big amount of territory from there. But what I would like to share is that the condition of Armavir is very poor. There are no excavations, but lake archaeologists work there or occur there very frequently. They destroy the site. Also, weather destroys the site. No one cares of that. But ancient Armavir has been a pronounced and very big city for the time. And I think we need to take care. We can talk a lot about Ani, for example, medieval capital of Armenia, but I can also say that Dvin, which is not less important than Ani, is located in the territory of current Armenia. Artashat is also mostly located in the current territory of Armenia, and Armavir as well. So I think the best would be to take care of those cities, which are very important historical monuments of Armenia. It's not just a monument, there are a bunch of monuments, and we could excavate a lot of stuff. But unfortunately, the condition of those sites, especially ancient Armavir, is very poor. And they bring garbage and throw it on the historical landmark in Armavir, and it is very sad to see.
That is very sad. Hovik, what's on your mind?
So July 15, this time last year, was when Armen Grigoryan passed away in the courthouse. And he passed away, many would say, as a victim of Nikol Pashinyan's regime. He was detained for 2 months, and his family was not allowed to visit him. And his crime was his speech. Even though the crime, eventually the legal code was thrown out based on complaints from Europe, it didn't come in time to help Armen Grigoryan. So our thoughts are with him and his family. And the second issue that I wanted to mention was Taguhi Tovmasyan being removed as the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights. Her offense was that she wasn't able to prevent or reprimand Edgar Ghazarian from calling the events of 2018 as an, quote, Azerbaijani Turkish revolution, which he did during the session where he was a nominee for the Human Rights Ombudsman. And he was referring, according to him, he was referring to the beneficiaries of the events, even though I would, still call it the Azerbaijani Turkish Revolution. Anyway, Arthur Hovhannisyan, if you remember, who is a civil contract MP who is head of another committee in the parliament, threatened to cut off the tongue and ears of Edgar Ghazarian that same day. Not a single reprimand of him, and apparently, he got off scot-free. And through essentially near unanimous voting by civil contract, the Armenian parliament does not have now a single opposition member leading any committee. It is now fully controlled by the civil contract regime. And the opposition won't nominate anyone new, even though it's their right, because they argue that it would essentially mean that civil contract can, anytime they choose, veto any nomination by firing that person, by essentially removing that person the same way they did Taguhi Tovmasyan. Meanwhile, Rustam Bakoyan, who is the deputy of Taguhi Tovmasyan, is now effectively the head of that committee. And many remember Rustam Bakoyan from pictures of his wife's bruised face. And according to media reports, he beat her to a pulp regularly. But apparently that's enough of a qualification to be the head of a human rights commission in the civil contract regime. That's it.
Thanks, Hovik. On my part, as Hrant mentioned earlier, we were talking before we started recording this show, and I mentioned that I have relatives visiting Yerevan right now. Over the weekend, they shared videos of how much fun they were having at the Vartevar celebrations with all the cold buckets of water and cannons of water dousing the milling people on a warm day, cars honking, and the whole Cascades area looking like a giant amusement park. Well, of course, I want to see my relatives and all diasporans visiting, connecting, and loving our Hayrenik, but also I could not help but think that all this joy and celebration is coming at the expense of a thought for our Artsakh brothers and sisters who remain in a blockade with empty shelves and empty stores, cars that don't run for lack of fuel, hunger and dispersion looming on the horizon. Hrant said that this year, unlike previous years, Vartevar seemed highly organized towards maximum distraction and entertainment. So one can't help but wonder what the government doesn't want people to think about. Okay, that's all the time we have today. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to our shows. Thank you, Hrant, for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Hrant.
Thank you for having me.
That's our show this week. We hope you found it useful. Please follow us on social media. We'll talk to you next week.